Are Russian assault tactics somehow getting worse? So much so that even Russian MilBloggers are calling foul? Plus, is the Russian propaganda machine ramping up in more than one language? And we're going to look at a case study of how Russian propaganda works. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is a really interesting story, is that Russian MilBloggers, the handful that haven't been corrupted or brought into the Kremlin's fold, so to speak, or just arrested, have begun to rail against what they see as a dangerous and reckless Russian tactic in order to get infantry to the front line. Several MilBloggers have actually criticized the Russian military for having light infantry assault units, ride atop armored vehicles to frontline positions, dismounting from the armored vehicles, and then conducting frontal assaults. Now, this is, as ISW points out, not really a novel tactic for Russian or even Ukrainian forces, but as you can probably infer, on a battlefield covered with anti-tank mines and artillery, as well as FPV drones, having an entire squad ride on top of an armored vehicle is kind of defeating the purpose. Now, the technique actually comes from the Soviet-Afghan War, where there would be Soviet BMPs and BTRs of that era were so poorly built that oftentimes when they would be hit with a Mujahideen RPG or a mine, that the doors themselves would break and would seal shut. The vehicles would oftentimes catch fire, resulting in very high casualties among the crew. And it happens so frequently that Russian infantry troops began to just ride on top of the vehicles, perceiving that they would rather be on a vehicle as it hits a mine or gets hit with an RPG than be inside of it as it becomes a death trap. So this is likely the formalization of a technique that was kind of evolved out of necessity. And this is a reflection of the fact that Russian armored vehicles are still the same basic designs. They still, as we've seen in Russian T-72s, are giant fire hazards. And so the infantry likely would prefer not to be inside these vehicles. And frankly, they would probably prefer not to have to walk, since infantry formation walking slowly across a journey of 10 kilometers plus, that's going to be easily observed by drones. And because light infantry walking is just move slow, it's going to be easy to target them with artillery or with drones. So moving fast, being on an armored vehicle, but outside the vehicle, it actually is something that makes infantry sense in its kind of Russian way. But the problem is that the Ukrainians basically have figured this out. And that the complaint is that the Ukrainians are targeting them, right, with artillery, FPV drones, mines. For example, one MilBlogger posted footage showing about 25 Russian personnel riding on the side of a tank. Then Ukrainian forces either struck the tank or the tank ran over a mine. The personnel had to dismount, run across an open area with no cover or concealment, while likely under fire, right? This is, one MilBlogger called it extremely crazy. And what's interesting is a lot of their complaints aren't necessarily that the armored vehicles are being used. The point is that they're turning around and leaving while the infantry conduct a frontal assault. It's like you support the infantry right up until the most dangerous point of the fight, and then the armored vehicles leave them to their own devices, which, as we've talked about, it only makes sense if the Russian forces are desperately short of armored vehicles, which is itself kind of a bad sign, right? And now don't get me wrong, the Ukrainian forces in their 2023 counteroffensive also use similar tactics, right? And the one MilBlogger acknowledged that there was a fixation when, Ukrainian forces did this, and it was considered a very poor tactical choice. But now that Russians do the exact same thing, their MilBloggers are out here trying to justify it, right? It's bad when even Russian MilBloggers start to acknowledge the level of cognitive dissonance they're operating under. Now, this tactic, and they point out that it's been identified for sure in Chasiv Yar has actually indeed produced some results for Russia. You can see in the last 24 hours, Russian forces advancing in Chasiv Yar, though it's notable that it's actually an advance over just open ground and into this forested area, which of course, this is exactly where you would expect that kind of tactic to happen, given that armored vehicles generally can't operate in swampy terrain or in this kind of forested area, right? They just can't operate in forests. So that's likely why we saw this tactic. But you can also see that kind of the closest, if you were operating an armored vehicle, you could maybe run them down this road and kind of dismount them around here, then have the infantry proceed without cover concealment, maybe along this route here. That would be my theory as to what exactly happened. But you can also see that there's been a few other gains, right? Near Novomykolaiv, as we've talked about, Russian forces making a really marginal advance here. Again, this is likely not supported by armored vehicles. This is likely the work of a light infantry units doing house-to-house work. And in Bodanivka, right, you can see here Russian forces trying really hard, pushing as hard as they can to cross this river here. Again, a small river, but an important again, natural barrier for Ukrainian lines. You can see the Ukrainians really trying to hold this high ground to the northwest of Bodanivka. So again, this is not working for the Russian military. The question is, can they sustain it? Is this a sustainable fight? And if you want to see exactly how the Ukrainians are countering it, I can't show you the footage here, but I'm going to be doing a deep dive analysis of it on combatvetnews.com today, right? This is, of course, you guys know YouTube cracking down really heavily on basically any war content of any kind, especially around Ukraine and Israel. You know, it's an election year for the United States. It's not a secret that tech companies have certain issues that they would prefer voters not think too hard about. But I don't think that's the way to do it. I don't believe that's a good way. I think as the electorate, you should be informed. You should get these perspectives. And you guys know I'm not some partisan hack. I'm covering the news, good and bad. But if you want that uncensored look and you want to support what I do, right? You want to enable me and the team to continue to do this every single day, 7 days a week. And you can, feel free to support me on here, right? Twice a week, you're going to get this uncensored combat footage, including today. The specialist tier will get you access to all of it. But if you really want to support the channel and you want the extra shout out, man, the lieutenant tier and the colonel tier folks, I really appreciate you. So thanks to all you guys that do it. And I'll see you guys on Combat Vet News here in a bit. But what I wanted to do before we do that is take a look at the Russian propaganda machine. It's been ramping up. And in a couple of different ways. First off, the Kremlin has been pushing this weird narrative that the Zelensky purchased a royal mansion in the UK, right? Now, what's interesting is this has kind of come through a bunch of weird things. There's an English language news site called the London Crier, which sounds, if it sounds fake, it's because it is. It literally has been taken offline already. It was registered just about 2 weeks ago and contains a bunch of copied and pasted news articles, some of which weren't even fully translated from Russian. Right. And the of course, it sounds like a London newspaper. And it published this story claiming that Ukrainian President Zelensky is the owner of something called Highgrove House, a estate owned by King Charles. You know that the Russian propaganda machine also became fixated on King Charles when he was briefly kind of incognito following his cancer diagnosis. The Russian propaganda machine claimed that he had actually died. The Russians have a weird fixation on the royal family, but they likely believe the royal family is similarly situated culturally to Vladimir Putin, right? Where if Putin were to die, it would be a massive crisis of confidence for the Russian public, whereas in reality, the royal family is little more than the UK's version of Taylor Swift. you notice some of the spelling here. Volodymyr Zelensky is the capital N new, capital O owner of Highgrove House, period. Previously owned, capital O, by King Charles. Very, very weird capitalization. Not something a real English language newspaper would ever do. But the interesting part about this story, right, is that it gets picked up, it gets purchased by this London Crier fake news site that they kind of cobbled together in a course of a couple weeks. But then it became picked up by this YouTube channel called Sam Murphy, who has 248 subscribers. So a really small YouTube channel. And let's see if we can find just how small this is. This guy, Sam Murphy. Okay, here's what's interesting. Sam Murphy, 310 subscribers, where he promotes, right, just 3 videos, all of which dropped 8 days ago. So this looks like a channel that really has just kind of been pulled out of nowhere, where it talks about King Charles having a real estate empire, a 42-second video on an update on the king's health, and then this video about purchasing Highgrove House, right? So you see how it's sort of multifactorial, and it's kind of cobbled together, right? But where things get even weirder is that you can see that, first off, it has a not a real basis, but it takes an existing story and sort of layers it and layers it and layers it until it's fake. Here's what I mean. There's actually allegations that Zelensky in 2019 actually did purchase London real estate using his money that he made as a performer and celebrity on a famous Ukrainian TV show. Zelensky, right, and his partners in his comedy production company actually purchased through some offshore companies a number of London real estate properties. Of course, here are some key differences. First off, it only happened after he made a bunch of money as a celebrity. It had nothing to do and didn't happen after he became president. In fact, when he became president, Zelensky actually handed over his share in these offshore companies over to his business partner who would manage it, because it was clearly a conflict of interest. Now, Zelensky's family continues to receive dividends, but this seems to be functioning like a blind trust, right? Where a trusted agent is managing the properties, but Zelensky has no say in how they're run, right? And it's sort of like as though he had a portfolio of like dividend stocks, right? Where his family would draw the returns, but wouldn't have say in how it's invested. So this is, again, it's not a nothing burger, right? It's not a great look for a celebrity, which is all he was at the time, to have these shell companies to purchase London real estate, right? It's not a great look, but it's a far cry from accepting ultra high net worth bribes from, UK property developers or whatever the allegations are. So the takeaway here, again, is that you have this little grain of truth that's like, it's a little uncomfortable that he did these things, which I got bad news for you guys. If you don't like that he did this, you're going to hate what every single U.S. politician on both parties do all the time, right? But then the story gets amplified, right? You can see the Russian embassy in South Africa repeating this story, right? Even though Twitter says this is a fake claim. It's secondhand information published by a week-old website, the Daily Crier, that in some cases forgot to translate its content from Russian into English, right? And you can see all these replies saying that it's been debunked, right? But the Twitterverse, right, still seems to be ramping up around this. See, here's one that said, and Zelensky's bought Highgrove House. Here's some that identify it as fake. Here's one that identifies it as real in the French language. You can see a lot of these Twitter accounts repeating these obviously debunked claims, right? And in a variety of languages. Here's 2 Japanese tweets. Here's a one that looks like it might be... No, this is in English, German, right? Some of these identify it as fake news, but some of them are just repeating exact Russian talking points. And you see the scale of astroturfing that's happening here, right? For every one debunking tweet, there's another one of these tweets with like kind of suspiciously AI looking profile pictures that are just reiterating this exact point, right? This exact story. And then it ends up getting picked up by somewhat more legitimate sounding news outlets, right? Here's an Azerbaijani news outlet that's picked up the story and kind of run with it. And you can see how this eventually can easily permeate into a right-wing news space, right? So don't be shocked if you see in the next week or two that a version of this story works its way into the mainstream news, despite the fact that it was disproven on basically day one. The other thing that I thought was interesting is we saw there just how international this Russian propaganda push is, right? And they are also targeting the French-speaking audience specifically. The French branch of RT and Sputnik Africa are trying to massage a French-speaking interview with a far-right politician who makes some claims that Zelensky is not the legitimate president of Ukraine, claiming that he had to that there was supposed to be an election at the end of March and there hadn't been. They point out, though, that actually conducting presidential elections in Ukraine while under martial law is prohibited under Ukrainian law. So the only way Zelensky could hold presidential elections is literally declaring an end to martial law, which the catch is you can't end martial law until, well, the war's over. That's kind of the catch, right? Or at least until you don't need martial law's provisions. But frankly, Ukraine kind of needs those provisions in order to streamline the command and control system in the face of Russian aggression. So this sort of spin is kind of core to the Russian propaganda effort, where they take a small, oftentimes nothing burger, not even a story, like a set of facts, right? Ukrainian law prohibits presidential elections, right? A Ukrainian celebrity put his money in London real estate. Then you add fake information to that story so that it is way, way, way crazier and worse than you think, right? The Ukrainian president is illegitimate. The Ukrainian president is seized power without holding elections, right? Zelensky's buying Prince Charles's houses and mega London mansions, right? You see how you can layer the story so that it has this little grain of, I won't even call it truth. It's based on a true piece of information with layers and layers and layers of lies until it has no semblance to reality. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you so much to the Colonel tier members. I'll see you guys over on Combat Vet News. We're going to drop this video in a couple hours, so I hope you'll join me. And thanks to all of our Lieutenant and Colonel tier members. See you in the next one. Cheers.